I've got something borderline blasphemous to say, and that is Bebop killed jazz. Bebop almost single-handedly, well, maybe not single-handedly, but almost single-handedly helped to knock off jazz as one of the most dominant forms of art in the country. And I am joined today by Mrs. 52Q's, the music historian, to help unpack why, and also talk about what we production music composers can learn from the downfall of jazz. Plus, we're going to take a listen to a plucky dramedy cue written by you, a member of the 52Q's community, on this week's episode of the 52Q's podcast. What is happening, everybody? This is Dave Kropf, and thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the 52Q's podcast, a weekly podcast dedicated to all things production and library music, where we talk about industry topics and take deep dives into the different aspects of being a working production music composer. Plus, we feature a cue written by you, a member of the 52Q's community, and this week we're going to be taking a listen to a plucky dramedy cue called KatzUndMaus, written by 52Q's community member, Leo Voin. So you definitely want to stick around for that. If this is your first time here, welcome. I'm so glad you found me, however you found me. I know you have a ton of options out there, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening via audio podcast. Just thank you for spending part of your day here with me. I also have to give a special word of thanks to the family, friends, and patrons of 52Qs who help keep the podcast, the channel, and everything we do here going. We are 100% community supported, so if you like what I do here, don't thank me, thank them. But if you want to learn more about how you can help support 52Qs and also unlock extra perks like live streams, Zoom feedback sessions, and a ton more, then be sure to click on the links in the description or stick around because we're going to be talking a lot more about that a little bit later in today's episode. So, yep, I know I could lose my graduate degree in jazz for saying that bebop killed jazz. Well, as soon as we start talking music history, I have to get some backup. So I brought Mrs. 52Q's back to the podcast to help talk a little bit about the history of jazz and how bebop and bebop musicians started looking inward and caused a tectonic shift in the popularity of jazz. Now, fair warning, I get pretty ranty in this. And so either you're going to love it or you hate it, but I do hope that you enjoy my chat with Mrs. 52Q's Shannon Kropf on how bebop killed jazz and how that's a cautionary tale for us media composers. It is always a great day when I get to invite my favorite person in the world back to the 52Q's podcast. Shannon, welcome back.
Thank you. It's lovely as always to be here.
You know, and if we're talking music history, I'm going to call you up off the bench.
You know, there are other people who know about music history, right?
Nope. You're the only one. You're
I'm
the only one.
The
only one. Well,
okay.
Well, it was so good. And I was telling people the other day in one of the office hours, like the conversations that we're about to have, these are the conversations we have just like hanging out and driving around or, over McDonald's or whatever. So
yes. As a matter of fact, we had to quit talking about this one because we had traveled off into some ethereal place of like, okay, we don't need to talk about that.
Nope, we don't need to talk about this. Well, my master's my undergraduate is in music history and my master's is in jazz. Your undergraduate is in music history and your master's is in musicology. So I feel like we are somewhat qualified to talk about this topic. And
at least a little bit, right?
And I love saying this. It's so inflammatory on purpose, but I love saying to a room of educated, either jazz musicians or educated music historians that bebop killed jazz. The rise of bebop helped to unseat jazz as the popular form of music in the United States. So I'm just going to lay that out there. If it wasn't for bebop,
right,
jazz might have hung around a little longer. I don't know if it could have I don't know if it could have stemmed the tide of popular music trends, but this is where we need your help. Can you give us a little bit, like, the rise of jazz and how jazz became so prominent and where bebop came from and why it really helped to kind of ring the death bell of jazz's popularity?
Okay. Well, that's a lot of information to give in 30 seconds.
You notice I got my big giant mug of coffee, so feel free to take your time.
Oh, yes. Well, jazz got started really in New Orleans, where there was a very unique cultural, multiracial environment. New Orleans was one of the only places where slaves had some freedoms. Like on Sundays, they could get together and hang out. And they did that in what's called Congo Square. It's still there. I think it's Louis Armstrong Square now. But and so people from all different countries and cultures and races would come together, and they would come and bring their music and traditions. And that's why we also have like voodoo traditions in New Orleans, is because the slaves were allowed to retain some of their own tradition and religion, and it kind of got mixed with Christianity, and then boom, voodoo.
Right.
That's not the topic of today's conversation. So anyway,
it's fascinating, but yeah.
Jazz really got started because we were hearing these melodies and what am I trying to say? The percussion rhythms.
Right.
And a funny thing happened at the end of the Spanish-American War. Back then it was pre-radio, and we didn't have radio to call in, send in the bombs or retreat or whatever. And so at that point, they were still using, the idea of marching bands for pomp and circumstance and all that, but also to make those calls on the fields. That's what the bugler was doing. Well, when the Spanish-American War was over, suddenly we had this giant influx of instruments into sort of the pawning general population. And so what happened was, because African-American music was so improvisational, guys just started picking up these cheap extra instruments, and they would just start playing on them, tunes that they knew, tunes that they were making up. And so eventually it became sort of these big outdoor groups that we think about, like with jazz funerals and stuff like that. And then as we get closer to World War I, that entertainment went indoors to to brothels and clubs and roadhouses and that type of thing. Well, as you can imagine, obviously it shrinks down from a big marching band to, a smaller 8 to 12 member group that's tolerable in a smaller room. And so that's really where jazz started. So the things I think to understand were the vast improvisational knowledge and talent that the original jazz players had. So it grows and grows and so on and so forth. And by World War II, we've got swing very firmly established. And swing is, the original jazz was good time party music, the Dixieland. There's a whole thing about Dixieland versus hot. But anyway, when I do a music history podcast, we'll talk about that. It's all kind of race-based on what you call what. But anyway, another story. So World War II, we have swing pretty firmly established, and certainly during World War II, it was the popular music.
And we're talking big bands.
Big bands, multiple big horn sections, sometimes drum set, and increasingly more as it went. So we're talking dance music, swing.
Yeah, Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, Count Basie,
all of that. And when this first started, it was an outgrowth of the smaller indoor bands of hot jazz and Dixieland jazz. And then, of course, it got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so the main point of swing was, in the beginning, it was, a bigger bunch of people getting together. There was some still improvisation at the beginning of swing. And it was just to people wanted to dance to it. There was not always lyrics, we have Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy, but we also have Swing, Swing, Swing.
Mm-hmm.
So
sing, sing.
Sing,
Yep. Even though swing, swing, swing's got to exist.
Swing, swing, swing. Okay. So we'll just edit that little mistake out. I know, Dave, he won't do it.
No.
I've just said swing so many times in the past 30 seconds. So we're talking about music for the masses. It was the popular music of the time. And when we say popular, I mean like, not necessarily like, ooh, pop music, but music that gets consumed by a very wide audience of people.
Yeah. Dominated radio, dominated record sales, sheet music sales. It's all this type of music.
You go to a supper club to hear a band, it's going to be a swing band for sure. And so, though it started off having some improvisation left in it, by the time we got over to like Duke Ellington, there was no improvisation, even in the solos or anything. Duke Ellington wrote every note of that out, and you played those notes. Period.
And if you
no discussion.
And if you didn't, then I mean, they come at
fired.
you.
Yeah, you're done
because it's Duke Ellington.
Play the notes.
So yeah.
Yes, and so obviously excellent, beautiful music coming out of that. But then a couple of things started to shift. The first thing, since we're talking about the musicians, is these guys would go and play these supper clubs. Now, these big bands had gotten very large, 20 people. And that's a lot of people to pay in wartime, right? So we started to see some financial instability going on with being able to hire a swing band.
Oh, and not to mention that some of the band leaders got drafted and went like Glenn Miller. Right.
I mean, Glenn Miller died in World War II, So, there's so many factors in this. But another thing is wartime materials weren't necessarily going to churn out trumpets. We were using materials in a different way. So we had some socioeconomic things going on, but then the main thing, I think, is that the musicians just wanted to play. They go into the supper clubs and they play the same set night after night after night. They're done by 10:30, 11 o'clock, and they're going to go out. And so what happened, this was all around the time during and a little bit after the Harlem Renaissance. So we had, Zora Neale Hurston and all these huge authors coming up and all this sort of change percolating. And it happened in music as well. So these cats like Earl Hines Orchestra, they would go after work, after they've played the dinner
gig,
club,
right?
After the gig. And they would hang out at Minton's Playhouse, and they would literally start playing music, and anybody who showed up would come up and play with them. So it was so diametrically the opposite of this scripted out swing thing. It was all improvisation.
But they shared vernacular. They shared a catalog because they all played the sweet band music. They all played this dance music. Yeah. And
so what they do is say, let's take the changes from Sing, Sing, Sing and just play over that. So that way they all knew the roadmap of where they were going, but then they were free to drive wherever they wanted. That's actually where we get the thing called rhythm changes. And Dave, you can speak more about the musicality portion of this, but the idea that we all have to have something to play to,
right?
Which gets ejected by Ornette Coleman 10 years later, but
that's another podcast.
also not the topic of this podcast. So rhythm changes is literally the changes that people would play
to I Got Rhythm,
over
like the jazz standard rhythm. I Got Rhythm, and so many of these were also pulled from musicals and If I Were a Bell from Guys and Dolls and those types of things.
Yep.
Anyway,
absolutely. Yep. So this starts to gain some traction, and at the same time, we're coming out of World War II, and so for consumers, swing had started to become a little bit dated, and it had started to sound like World War II. And we were ready to leave that behind. So there's this gaping chasm of something needs to go here. Also, at the same time, we had bunches and bunches of little tiny record companies popping up, what we would call indies today, across a variety of genres. I mean, we had race records since 1917 when recording was first done. And so these record companies, large and small, are looking around for like, okay, what's going to fill this void? And here up pops this bebop thing. Well, the whole thing with bebop is that it's anti-swing. It's about as far from swing as you can get. And what I mean by that is it's not meant to be danceable. It's not meant to be singable. It's not meant for the enjoyment of the audience. It's meant for the enjoyment of the player. You know, I'm going to get up here and I'm going to have fun.
It showcases the showcases a virtuosity of the performer.
That was the word I was just getting ready to use. And so, you know, it's all about how hot you can blow and your chops and, you know, all of this. But the record companies see it and they are like, okay, maybe this is it. And so they pretty aggressively at 1945 to 1950 marketed it as popular music, just like swing had been. And I think people were on board for a minute, but, you know, if you're not super hardcore into music, if you're just, you know, Sally Goforth hanging out, wanting to hear some music on a date night, it's not exactly that,
yeah.
right?
You're not gonna like have a date over, you know, light some candles and make some dinner and then pop in like ornithology, right? That's not what you're gonna play.
It's not gonna happen. And so the public started already to kind of turn away from it, and then the public, of course, these are very big strokes here, but they sort of started to learn about the seedy underbelly of bebop with the heroin usage and the, you know, some of that, the drug
you mean
culture.
The things that happen at 2 a.m. in these little dive bars in New York City and Chicago.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. This is, we're just saying, this is just the history, folks.
That's right. And so it, as people do with music, the general public sort of decided that it was a what am I trying to say? A less desirable form of music because of the associated activities that might go along with it. Okay. And so meanwhile, the guys are over there doing their thing, and it's just like, if this is the next phase of jazz, we're not into it. Like the public's going, I don't get it. I don't like it.
And it was super multicultural.
Yeah.
You'd have like Benny Goodman going to these sets at these little clubs. So instead of having, you know, 30 people on stage, you would have 5 or 4.
Right.
And they're carrying the entire load. And like I said, you would have Benny Goodman, a white clarinet player, playing with, you know, Charlie Parker, a black saxophone player.
Yep.
And it wasn't a thing.
Right.
It wasn't a thing.
Exactly.
But the public in 1950 or 1948, they weren't
not quite ready for that yet. Yep. And even into the early days of rock and roll, we're not quite ready for that level of cultural influence across racial lines.
Booker T and the MGs, you are on in 5.
God bless them. And Pat Boone for stealing Little Richard's music.
That's a whole other podcast. That's for your music history podcast.
Right. And Little Richard walked that back. For those of you who do know what I'm talking about, he walked that back later in life. Yep. So bebop's the next form of jazz. It does not succeed as a commercially viable sort of music. It does gain some traction in France and then comes back and gets a little traction in the US, but not, you know, by that time we're getting into the jump blues and Louis Jordan and it's all moving toward rock and roll.
Yeah.
And so by 1955, you have pretty firmly established the beginning of rock and roll. And that, of course, obliterates bebop completely. You know, it becomes an afterthought at that point. So that's how bebop killed jazz.
and the record companies knew that this was happening. And this is why we would see Like in 1959, we would have Dave Brubeck and the cool jazz, West Coast jazz.
Oh, yeah.
The record companies are like, whoa, 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 time out. Literally, no, that was an unintended pun. But we recognize that we are losing massive amounts of ground in popularity. So let's make some jazz that is more accessible.
Right.
And we have Dave Brubeck's Time Out. Still, to this day, the top-selling jazz album of all time.
Yep. And it's great. It's fun to listen to. It's musically advanced without being elitist.
Mm-hmm.
And odd time signatures and things like that. You can hum along to it, but great. But at that point, it was almost
the damage was done. It was too late.
The damage was done.
The public had moved on. I mean, 1959 also saw the release of Kinda Blue by Miles Davis.
Oh, yeah.
And interesting.
1959 was a huge year for this transformation of jazz.
Yeah. And of course, I'm a huge fan of Miles Davis because he came up.
He does everything, man.
He really does. And it's one of the points when we talk about like the lessons, the takeaway lessons, the cautionary tale. And why we're even talking about this on a production music podcast.
Right.
But what I love about Miles Davis is that he was not the fastest player. He wasn't a Dizzy Gillespie.
Right.
But what he was he made excellent note choices.
Yes.
And so he leveraged what he could do. And that enabled him to have a significantly longer career.
Right. And he continued to change his styles throughout all of these subsequent cool jazz, East Coast, West Coast, all the different little subgenres that came after bebop. He's got like one record in all of them. And it's crazy how he just continued to change with the musical styles.
So here are the lessons that we need to take away from this as production music composers. And if you've been following me, you know where this is going. And the first one is that the audience is the real gatekeeper here. The audience gets to assign the value in the music that we are creating. And I know that can be tough to hear. I hear you there on the Peloton. I see you, right? No, not really. That'd be creepy. But I hear what you're saying. But remember, in production music world, we're not making music for ourselves. Remember, we're artisans and not artists. And as soon as that starts shifting, which is fine if it shifts, bebop existing wasn't a problem. The problem became when these jazz musicians only found satisfaction doing those things, but then not having an audience willing to pay for it. And if the audience isn't willing to pay for it, then, and if your job is to try to make a living making music, then you're going to have some tough sledding, as many of those bebop musicians had. I mean, Charlie Parker was the poster child for successful bebop. He was amazing. Also, wildly self-destructive.
Yep.
As many musicians of this era are or were. But the audience gets to decide the value. You don't get to decide the value and then shove it down their throat. And if they don't get it, then screw them. I mean, I guess you can.
I mean, you can have that attitude.
Yep.
But you're going to go work at Starbucks.
Which is fine.
Instead of writing music. Starbucks is great. I'm not hating. Don't put comments. No. I'm just saying, if you're striving to make a living in music and you have that attitude of, well, I have it right, screw them. That doesn't work.
And that's the reason these players started congregating in these small little dive clubs was because they were feeling unfulfilled musically during the gig. The gigs that were paying the bills, they didn't feel fulfilled, so they went and made their own thing. The problem happened, though, when trends shifted away and suddenly that's like all they wanted to do. Or that was the only thing that was considered, quote unquote, real jazz. And believe it or not, this mentality, this elitism carries forth in colleges and universities around the world because Because if you study a jazz program, ask me how I know. I have a master's in it. If you study a jazz program, chances are you are going to be deeply steeped into the bebop tradition.
That's right. To this day, one of the things that happened with bebop is that musicians, players of that time studied Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and all these guys who are just... And the remarkable thing about it to me is today, 70 years later, you're going to study the same artists and the same styles, which tells me that jazz is frozen in time.
It is. It has firmly become art music, and it's studied the same way in the modern educational system that Beethoven is studied.
Yeah. And Dave, that's happened within our lifetimes.
It really has.
Because if you remember at Appalachian State, the jazz guys were kind of everybody sort of looked down on them because they were the hippie,
Right.
druggy guy, or whatever. Yep. I don't really remember. It was a long time ago. But it was definitely sort of a less than thing. But these days, it's fully accepted as art music and fully nurtured within that system. Absolutely.
And there are folks trying to push out of that and merge other styles, but there still exists those purists, those bebop purists. Yeah. And as soon as the bebop players lost sight of the audience, they lost the audience. And the reason I feel like they lost the audience is because they were feeling unfulfilled, which is the first thing.
We've all been there.
And if you need to go make music,
I'm playing a Christmas gig and I am unfulfilled.
If you need to make music for yourself, go make music for yourself. But what the further issue with bebop musicians is it is an inherently selfish form of music.
Right.
I know I'm waiting for the jazz police to swoop through the window SWAT style, but it's inherently selfish. It's all about pleasing yourself. And there's a word that I'm not going to use, but that's what it is. I'm not going to say it, Shannon. I promise. I promised you before we met. I'm not going to say it, but that's what it is. It's musical self-gratification to the expense of your audience. And some audience members love that. Like they'll sit there and because they understand it, it's like going and seeing somebody rap 100 words per second in a foreign language. If you speak that foreign language, it's amazing and it's impressive, but it is not for everybody. And so as soon as you start making the music about yourself and your personal satisfaction as a player, then it's no wonder people aren't going to roll up for that. It's no wonder people aren't going to pay their money for that, especially in a recovering economy post-war. I mean, the 50s, this was some of the most prosperous time for a certain segment of the American population that we had seen, that post-war era. This is when we figured out freaking how to go to the moon.
Right. And I will say, we're not saying don't try new things. Absolutely try new things. 100%. When Dave started writing for the NFL, that whole kind of hip hop marching band sound was not really prevalent. And he started writing it and now it's everywhere. I'm not saying he's the progenitor of that style, but it's not necessarily a causal relationship, but he did hook into something new that was happening. Right. So yeah, absolutely keep your eye out for the latest trends and what's cool and what's not. And, for God's sake, don't put pizzicato strings in dramedy cues or whatever,
And yet they still keep getting used.
And yet they still get used.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to sum up. Yeah, try new things. But when you get into this mindset of like, y'all don't know what you're talking about. I know everything. This is good. You should like it.
Yeah. When your personal satisfaction as a composer comes above the satisfaction and the enjoyment, I'll take it one step further. The usability of a library or a publisher, then
you're just not going to make any money. You might be fulfilled all day long,
you're
but
really not.
You're going to work somewhere else.
Which is why when I did my own jazz combos, it was Bebop free.
Mm-hmm.
The tagline, because I was in a jazz combo in Memphis. We were the teacher's lounge, right? Because it was all, professors from the school we were teaching at. We were the teacher's lounge, and it was standards.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It was, if Joe Q Public didn't know the tune on some level, then we probably didn't play it. No deep cuts, no weird B-sides, no music that I want to play just because I enjoy playing it.
Yeah. And, I'm even thinking back to this gig. I forget where it was, but it was with Neil and all those guys. And we played Well You Needn't.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow in my whatever, I had just missed that song. I didn't know it. But I picked it up, instantly because it's so groovy and so accessible. So
yeah, and that's Thelonious Monk. It's one of his most popular, and
it is one of his most accessible.
It's one of his most accessible. That's right, which is great, and it was part.
Monk, by the way.
Yeah, that's a great song. Great song.
Yes.
But when bebop became about satisfying yourself, it was doomed because nobody wants to draw up a bubble bath and listen to somebody squawk for 8 straight minutes.
Right.
I'm totally betraying how I actually feel about this.
Now, how do you really feel, Dave? Why don't you tell us?
It's so unpleasant to listen to for very long. It's work. It sounds like homework.
It is work. I don't hate it as much as you do, but I also kind of like Free Jazz by Ornette Coleman for totally different, not as music I would have a bubble bath to, because that's just nuts. But for the soundscape and texture of it, I enjoy it. But
yeah, see, I think my sensibilities are offended by the mindset of the bebop player, and that it completely clouds. Because before I ever got into production music, I'm like, what? No, nobody's going to hire us to come to their cafe and play
and blow
free
heat.
And play heat and play free jazz, and play giant steps in all 12 keys at 300.
Right.
There are going to be
Donna
2
Lee.
people. Right. Gosh. There are going to be 2 or 3 people who are going to be really into it than everyone else. And I've been to these gigs where there is an increasing halo of people leaving the area.
Right.
The longer we play, the emptier the tables get because it's not the right venue.
Right.
You want the venue, then go to a jazz club where people's intention are to experience and listen to that. That's fine. But we are the jazz band showing up to play cocktail music underneath a wedding reception or underneath a corporate dinner. That's what we're doing here. Some people would call that wallpaper music. And I know plenty of jazz musicians who bag on that whole scene. But you know what? That freaking pays the bills.
Mm-hmm.
It pays the bills. Just like those bebop players, they still kept their day jobs playing those sweet bands, playing those dance bands.
Yep.
Because it pays the bills. So don't be an elitist. Don't be a selfish performer. You will lose sight of your audience. And in our case, as production music composers, our audience, they're our editors and our publishers.
Mm-hmm.
They get to call the shots. They get to assign value.
That's right.
Now, there are some other takeaways that we can take away. And the other one is don't fear change. Lean into it. Right. We talked, a previous episode about, are the robots coming to take our jobs and all of that. But, when the electric piano came out, it was this tectonic shift. Many jazz musicians didn't dig it. It wasn't pure enough. But Herbie Hancock, who had cut his teeth with Miles Davis.
I almost mentioned him earlier.
Embraced it. and launched an entirely new career. I mean, you want to talk about even more so than Miles Davis, I would say Herbie Hancock reinvented himself and was able to stay more relevant across more generations than Miles. Miles Davis, even when in his electric kind of, bitches brew funky exploration, he was still like Miles Davis. But Herbie Hancock, who, to be honest, I hadn't even heard of before Rocket.
Agreed.
He had been playing with Miles Davis, man.
When I found out that Herbie Hancock was a jazz musician, it blew my mind. Because I'm of the generation who had only heard of him from Rocket. And somewhere between that and Miles Davis, we have Chameleon, which is this fusion.
Cantaloupe Island, Watermelon Man.
Yeah, exactly.
He dominated the 60s. He was on. Anyway, I'm getting all worked up. But Herbie Hancock embraced it. Miles Davis embraced it and reinvented himself and rolled with technology. He came out and put out Rocket, right? Which was in 1983 off the album Future Shock, and dominated MTV. He didn't fear MTV. He didn't fear Rocket. He didn't fear the oncoming of hip hop. He leaned into it. He embraced it. And he reinvented himself. And that's what we have to find ourselves doing, whether you write trailer music or whether you write dramedy cues or tension cues. Embrace it. Go where the trends are going. Still be yourself, but ultimately allow the audience to have some say in what you're doing.
Right.
And so don't fear change. You might have to reinvent yourself. I mean, rock and roll came and put a big old hurting on like modern jazz quartet, when we start hearing like hard bop, and we start in the drums, instead of the hi-hat holding 2 and 4, now we have the snare drum hitting 2 and 4. That's a direct result of rock and roll's influence on jazz.
Absolutely. 100%.
So Elvin Jones, chef's kiss, the king of that. But Elvin Jones also, also played with John Coltrane, Art Blakey.
Right.
Same way. We start feeling funk's influence because some jazz musicians recognized that there is some good happening over here that we can work into us. But the purists, the pure bebop guys, dinosaurs sinking slowly into the tar pits of time, into where they will now be fossilized and studied and scrutinized and copied until the end of time. And that's not what I want to do.
So you're saying they're immortal?
Well, yeah. I mean, we're still freaking playing giant steps. It's a standard,
Right. So what else can we learn, Dave?
So should I put a warning? Warning, Dave gets ranty and soapboxy. And then just don't bury your head in the sand as well. Just like whether it's Miles Davis, Herbie Hancock, Dave Brubeck. Dave Brubeck came out with Time Out as a reaction to say, hey, time out. Again, no pun intended. We're losing sight of what we should be doing. Let's make music that is singable. I mean, that was one of the, like, can you hum the melody? And if he couldn't, then he wasn't having any part of it.
Yep.
And he came out with Time Out, and he has like songs in 5/4 and in 9/8. It just makes me sad, I guess, at the end of the day. Because before I really studied jazz, I liked bebop. Then the more I kind of started understanding, I was like, oh, wait a minute, this is so...
This is never meet your heroes type of thing,
It really
right?
is. Like, it's so selfish and is so antithetical to who I am as a performer, but also as a composer. It's about serving others. It's about giving something that they want in a medium that you enjoy doing, so that everybody wins. They get the music they
Right.
want. You get to make music, and you get to make money making music. And I can't think of anything like better in the world than being able to make money.
We do have a very good life that way, don't we?
We can just literally make money out of thin air, just out of my brain into a computer, and royalty checks show up. So
it's not the worst thing in the world.
It's not. And we believe we've done all of those little chumpy jobs, whether it's working at dollar theaters or third shift at American Express. We've done it all. Absolutely done it all, while trying to keep our keep music, part of our lives.
That's right.
But are there any other history notes that you can think of that you would want to? I know I kind of beat the audience over the head about it.
Not off the top of my head. There's a lot of sort of kismet that happens right around the 1950s, with chess records, for instance, popping up around the time Howlin' Wolf decided to plug in a guitar, And so some of this will always be down to, it's not chance, it's the people who are working really hard to do something awesome who find each other. And so all of that to say, there's no doubt that these bop musicians could just play their asses off. I mean, we get it. And there's some composers who can just compose circles around anybody I know. What is the motivation of all that? How does that come together? How do you, I think I said this in our last podcast recording. I used to think it's all who you know, that old phrase, it's all in who you know. I used to think that meant you had to be friends with like the vice president of production in order to get, that's not it at all. It's the cultivation of relationships throughout your life that it comes back around and like, hey, you want to work on this thing together? Yeah, I think I do. And then something beautiful comes out. So all of that to say, there is a universe out there where bebop succeeded. So don't be afraid to try new things, and don't be afraid to jettison an idea when it's not going to work.
Yeah, no, that's really good. That's really good. It's not bebop's fault.
Right.
Right. You know what I mean? It was what we did with it, and the myopic, myopism, is that a word?
I don't know.
the navel gazing that happened, and then the subsequent temper tantrum when popular trends shifted away, and now suddenly it's like, wow, they don't even know any better. The uncultured Philistines, how dare they not appreciate the fact of how fast I can play a D
when
minor
I'm
scale.
hopped up on drugs,
right? High out of my mind on heroin. I don't know what voice that was.
Now, I will say not all bebop musicians were on heroin. There's plenty who are not. So,
yeah, but you know what? The movie Ray tackles that really well, and I think shows a good example. I don't know if you remember the scene where, he was heroin, but
I know we watched that. I don't remember anything about it. I need to go back and watch it.
Yeah, how it was like you need it, and it's not just heroin. Like Charlie Parker, I mentioned self-destructive tendencies. He had a massive alcohol problem. There's stories of him falling asleep on the bandstand, and somebody he gave his seat partner a pin, like a needle, said just poke me when it's my time to play, and he would poke him, and he'd wake up and blow, and then fall back asleep.
Well, it was the same thing with Billie Holiday. Here's this beautiful, talented, has a great, musical partner in Louis Armstrong, and she just couldn't walk away from that stuff, and I get really emotional about her because by the time the last photograph we have of her, she's just, she's not who she was. So I don't know. I don't know why we're talking about drug use for
I think it's important.
15 minutes of this podcast.
No, I think it's important because I think it's indicative of what happens when you are so inward and you're so chasing the art that your inner demons can kind of get free reign over your choices.
Yeah.
And even that had an effect. Like I heard a phrase in school that if you want to play like Bird, Charlie Parker, if you want to play like Bird, you have to be like Bird. So it was actually encouraged. I've heard stories of people encouraging to either alcohol or other substance abuse, and then, and only then, are you able to tap into the mastery, into the stratospheric level of genius. And that's some Icarus flying too close to the sun stuff right there.
Yeah, and I got to tell you, it doesn't just pop out, when you get high either.
Right.
I mean, there's stories of John Coltrane literally standing in the corner running scales for hours at a time.
Yeah, playing a C major scale for 8 straight hours. Yep.
Once you say mastery, that's a whole different conversation, because these guys did put the work in. That this stuff didn't just pop out of them. And once you understand jazz theory, even though audiences didn't like it, it's very elegant in what it does with modes and with extended chords and hybrid chords and altered chords, and where the melody is being played up in these upper partials of these chords instead of on the root third, fifth. So, mastery, they were masters of music and of their instruments, and nobody cared.
Yeah, I mean, they were truly pushing the boundaries of what this art form was. But you're right, because it was so far removed, it was so incomprehensible to someone who, I just want to drink and I just want to listen to good music. Right? That's really all I want to do here. I am in good company, Shannon. There's also one famous jazz musician who notoriously hated bebop. Do you know who it is? Do you remember? Hated it. Says, I don't like it. He says, I don't like it. That's my really bad impression. Let me listen.
Post-bop?
Oh, no. Nope. Old vaudevillian. Played trumpet.
About Burt Williams.
Played cornet like he sang.
Louis Armstrong?
Louis Armstrong.
Of course.
Hated bebop because Louis Armstrong was a performer first from the vaudeville tradition of entertain. My role here is to give you a good time, to entertain you.
Right.
And he recognized that bebop didn't do that.
That's right.
And he famously hated bebop. Yep.
I guess it depends on what you're trying to do.
That's right. And if you're listening to this and you're like, "Well, Dave's full of crap," then that's fine. Just don't try to be production music. Go off and do your art. Go. You have my permission.
The world needs you.
The world does need you. The world needs Ornette Coleman and John Coltrane and Charlie Parker. The world needed that. But just don't try to have the general public assign the value to it. Because those are incompatible goals. So as production music composers, we have to have the goals in mind. We have to have the end result, the usability. That has to be front and center first. I mean, it's the intersection of art and commerce, right? It's not art and then commerce. It's a Venn diagram. It's an overlap.
Yep.
And we have to treat it that way. Well, Shannon, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome.
It's always great to have you. Yes, it's always great to have you. And can I just say, never been more attracted to you than I am right now. When you flex your music chops. There's a reason we've been together. I embarrassed you. Look at you blushing.
I'm blushing a little. That's not what I expected.
Oh, it's okay.
Okay.
We're among friends here, just me and
We're around
2,530
2,000 of your
closest friends.
buddies.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean. I'm not going to edit this. All right, it's really, and this is quite literally what we talk about over dinner, and
It is. It is.
This is why we're together. But I appreciate you, and obviously you are welcome.
I appreciate you too.
Welcome back anytime. So we are going to take a quick break, and we're about to hear more from Shannon. We're going to hear Shannon. She's going to tell us all about 52Qs and how you can join the community and all the great things we got going on. But when we return, we are going to be taking a listen to KatzUndMaus by Leo Voin, which is a plucky dramedy cue.
Hey y'all, I'm Shannon Kropf, and I want to tell you that the 52Qs podcast is made possible by viewers and listeners just like you, composers and producers who are looking for a better way to connect and collaborate. You see, 52Qs isn't just another website selling static, pre-recorded videos to a mass audience. It's a fun, vibrant, and positive community that comes together online for sharing cues, getting feedback, and discussing what's up in the production music industry. You'll find both personalized feedback and live interaction, which are the best and fastest ways to grow your skills and earn more placements. The best part is that the 52Qs community is absolutely free. And when you're ready to take your career to the next level, we offer friends and family subscriptions, which unlock weekly live streams, live interactive group feedback sessions, monthly interactive workshops, and more. Head over to 52qs.com and sign up today. And while you're there, check out our personalized feedback videos, private lessons, and of course, merch. I can't wait to see you at 52qs.com.
All right, that was KatzUndMaus by Leo Voin. Leo, thank you so much for sending this along. I really did enjoy this. I always love me a good dramedy cue, let alone a dramedy cue that uses the German technique of taking multiple words, smashing them together to make one epic word. So I really liked this. I feel like... first of all, the main motif, everything, I think this is all working really, really well. I do think that there's like a high-pitched thing here at the top that felt a little too... It's a little high, and it's a little busy. And I think we could have kind of eased into the rhythmic complexity a little bit more and simplify... So so just ease into it. So it's not, and it might even be a triangle opening, closing. Just ease into it a little bit so that you have kind of somewhere to go. Love the harmonic motion here. I think that's working well. And I like that. I like that. It's almost like a cool modern texture, that kind of synthy, distorted, clicky kind of sound. I think that's working. But that bell thing, I think, is still too busy. And at the end of these phrases, bump, 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 I feel like we could have created a little more separation. Like dun dun dun, and then pull everything kind of back, and then ease into everything else. And the vibra slap for the win. Love me some good vibra slap, and that's the perfect amount of vibra slap, which is like once. He's not Crazy Train, right? So you don't have to get all up into that. There's a marimba thing in the background here that doesn't feel like it's quite working with the harmony. And I feel like you have a marimba motif, which is unchanging and then changing the chords underneath it. And I feel like it's causing some unintended dissonance. But I think it's right in here when the chord shifts up, which again, I think works well. But that marimba in the background, not moving up with it, feels a little wonky. Yeah, right there. All right. Like the vibra slap, a little guiro goes a long way as well. And I feel like maybe got too much of a good thing here. The guiro, I feel like, could come back. And I feel like through here into the breakdown section, I felt like we could have left more space in the instrumentations. Bloop, bloop, bloop. And it might just be removing a layer or two or creating more kind of stopping and starting motion, because that's part of what gives dramedy its comedic value, and it's the incidentalness of dramedy. Nice. And just like the other edit point, I feel like we could have left a little bit more space in between. So it's more of a stop. I mean, you don't want to go to zero, but more of kind of a stop and then a build up. I think this is really, really good. And I would have held this gear of energy until after the breakdown, because this is similar to the energy level we had right before the breakdown. Am I wrong in that? It might be a little busier. All right, and I'm not digging these claps. If anything, I would do snaps. And I would probably put those on beat 3 to imply a halftime groove. 1, 2, 3, 4. Because we have a lot of 8th and 16th note energy, and I think boom, boom, boom. Boom, 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 boom. Boom, 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 boom. I think it would have been a nice touch. Boom, boom, boom. And I would have hit that. I would have tagged that one more time, or maybe twice. Boom, boom, boom. Boom, 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 boom. 3, 4. Boom, boom, boom. Bum, 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 bum. One more time, and bum, 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 bum. You can even get away. Bum, 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 bum. Right. So just extend the ending a little bit, because that harmonic change is so well done, and I think we could have exploited it a little bit more. But in general, love this. Love the title, KatzUndMaus. I really, and I just involuntarily say that in my admittedly terrible German accent. This was submitted during our week 48 weekly feedback thread, and this is something that we do every single week at 52 Cues. We put a feedback thread where folks post their cues and leave feedback and receive feedback, and if that's something you're interested in, why don't you join us over at 52 Cues? And if you found that review helpful, I do things like this for our community members and for those who aren't a member of the community. Just head over to 52cues.com/coaching, where you can order up a feedback video where I will explore the mix, the master, EQ, form, structure, harmonic analysis, or melodic tendencies, and even your title. I'll look at all of those. That is a service that I offer. Video feedback critiques, and I also do one-on-one sessions via Zoom, as well as a quarterly mastermind course. So I would love to have you. Why don't you once again head over to 52cues.com/coaching. But that's going to do it for us today. You don't want to miss next week, where I am going to ask, is this all still worth it? The hours that we put into writing, the royalty checks, the lack of royalty checks, the rejections, the ghosting, is it still worth it? You don't want to miss that. So if you haven't already, smash that subscribe on YouTube, or be sure to leave us a review. Actually, I don't think I've mentioned this. Leave us a review over at Apple Podcast or Google Podcast or wherever you get fine podcast programming. But once again, that's going to do it for me. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate you. And as always, a huge shout out and thank you to the family, friends, and patrons of 52 Cues who help keep this going. So I hope that you had a great week 48, and I know that you are going to have a fantastic week 49. How do I know that? Because I know and I believe that the universe has amazing plans just for you. Until next time, peace. The 52 Cues podcast is copyright 2022 Dave Kropf, all rights reserved. The music played on the podcast is copyright of their respective owners and is used for educational purposes only. For more information, including joining the 52 Cues community and submitting your cue for consideration on the podcast, head over to 52cues.com.